Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first panel of this conference. The title for the first discussion is the JCPOA and the Struggle for a New World Order. We have four distinguished guests. Ambassador Eric Danon, the French ambassador to Israel. Ambassador Dan Shapiro, the former U.S. ambassador in Israel and also a scholar in the INSS for a few years. Behnam Ben Taleblu, I hope I'll get to pronounce it right by the end of the session, is an Iran scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And Colonel retired Eldad Shavit is a senior researcher at the INSS and a former officer at the IDF's intelligence branch. We'll try to provide a sort of an overview of current Iranian events while focusing on the future of the JCPOA and the strategic events at large. There will be, of course, 6 more panels during the day, as Sima has mentioned, so we'll try not to steal all of their thunder. But we won't avoid completely touching on the most recent events, which include both the protests in Iran and the Iranian support for Russia in the brutal war in Ukraine. So I think my first question to the panelists would regard the chances of resuming negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran after the midterm elections in the U.S. Dan, perhaps you want to start?
Thank you. Almost good to be here, good to be with my fellow panelists, and it's great to be back home at INSS. Thank you, Sima, and others for the invitation. My sense is that the chances of a resumption of negotiations on JCPOA talks are quite low. And that doesn't particularly change after the midterm elections. The deal that had been attempted to be negotiated, a return to the JCPOA or a slightly updated version of the JCPOA, we know it would not have provided all of the same benefits in terms of time as the original JCPOA because of Iran's advances, but the deal was essentially negotiated and available for conclusion first in March of this year, and then after a hiatus of talks again in August of this year. And on both occasions, Iran really walked away from that opportunity. The Biden administration, I think, would have been prepared to finalize those deals, but Iran, in the first instance, held out for a number of unrealistic demands. For example, the demand that the IRGC be removed from the foreign terrorist organizations list. Second, that the IAEA safeguards investigations at the undeclared sites be shut down. And President Biden refused those consistently. And of course, now we have the new obstacles that you just briefly referenced. We have the protests and the brutal suppression of those protests by the Iranian regime. Iran undoubtedly believes, and at times has indicated this belief, that the United States and other foreign powers are behind those. This obviously makes them even more, let's say, inward-focused, more hardline. They understand, I think, they should understand, that some of the sanctions relief that might have been available in the deals that was being negotiated in March or in August is now probably at risk and perhaps unavailable. Relief of sanctions on the Supreme Leader's office, for example, given the suppression, or perhaps because of the support for Russia in Ukraine, that in violation of UN Security Council 2231, additional sanctions relief is probably unavailable. And they're in a regime survival mode. This is a regime that, whether they believe this is an actual threat to the stability of the regime or not, and I think we can, experts much more than I can speculate on that, certainly is going to be more cautious about the concessions it would make while it's under this kind of pressure. Again, I believe the support for Russia and Ukraine. President Herzog came to the Atlantic Council, are now affiliated, and revealed photographs of Iranian drones used against civilian targets in Ukraine. There's now, of course, evidence that ballistic missiles may be the next form of assistance. I believe that is going to harden not just the U.S., but broader Western and certainly European attitudes that will prevent some of the additional sanctions relief that might have been possible. I'll just close with this. It's really not the focus of Washington's policy discussions at the moment. From my understanding, there is no internal discussion right now in the Biden administration on what would it take to restart talks, which of those sanctions that might have been, or sanctions relief that might have been offered initially would no longer be available. They would have to go through that process even to begin a negotiation, of course. But for now, it's not on the agenda. The focus is on supporting the Iranian people in their right to protest against this brutal regime, and of course, preventing and punishing Iranian support for Russia and Ukraine. So I believe at the moment the prospects of a resumption of talks are actually very, very low.
So we're at the beginning of the World Cup. Let's gamble. What's the percentage?
I'm a terrible gambler, but
nobody's keeping score.
For me, anytime soon, this is a less than 25% prospect.
Which is interesting because had we met here in May, you probably would have said differently.
Probably, but things have happened since then.
Ambassador Danon, could you share Paris's view, and is it different than the view from Washington?
First, thank you for the invitation and bravo. What a room. No, more or less the same views. Technically speaking, we could have a deal, and we were close to the deal. And then the Iranians invented something which was different. It was about IAEA and the inspections, and they wanted to close old files about what IAEA wanted. But those things were on the NPT side and nothing really related to the JCPOA by itself. So technically speaking, we could do something. Now, politically speaking, I think that it becomes more and more difficult. Not only because the more we go, the more the situation in Iran is difficult. But because, for instance, in the United States, with the midterm elections, more and more people are saying, we don't want any kind of deal with Iran as it is a rogue state or a terrorist state. Look at the domestic situation and look at what they are doing with Russia as an ally. So I think that, politically speaking, for the Biden administration today, it would be very difficult to accept a deal regarding the situation in the country, the midterm elections, and, of course, what Iran is doing today. So now, what is going to happen? Absolutely nobody knows. It is impossible to predict anything because you don't know what is going to happen in Tehran in terms of these riots, etc. Could be the time to change the regime, but maybe not. And nobody, that's a black swan. You just can't imagine. So it's a bet, and nobody can bet on that. It's not fair to bet on that. And about the alliance with Russia, that is something, of course, totally new, but which reinforces the cooperation between Russia and Iran, not only as a debt, but Russia, if you see what they have done in Syria, for instance, at the end of it, they began to talk and say to, with Bashar, and say to the Western countries, okay, you failed in Syria, and now it's my turn, and Astana and all things, and now they are in. they could do something like that with Iran, saying, now we have a cooperation, you, the Western countries, you have failed. So it's our turn to try to do something with Iran, which will more or less block Iran to have a nuclear bomb, but not to become a threshold country. But that's only a out-of-the-box hypothesis. It's not the French position at all, etc. But it's what I see is that Russia always comes in an opportunist way in many countries when they do consider that Western countries cannot continue what they wanted to do. And that I feel, but that's really personal, that something of that kind is happening with Iran today between Russia and Iran. But maybe it's too much, I don't know.
Thank you. Behnam, reading your articles recently, you haven't spared criticism from the Biden administration, and so has the FDD for quite some time. But now we're at a surprising junction where the midterms turned differently than most analysts have assumed. There was no red wave to speak of. Democrats are holding the Senate. Quite a surprise. How would you see the Biden administration's policies towards Iran, considering what happened in the midterms? And then Eldad, can you assess the relationship between the Biden administration and what is about to be Israel's most extreme right-wing government in history?
Well, sure. Thank you again for the kind introduction, and to Seema and everyone at INSS for hosting. Actually, I think it was well before the pandemic. It was my first time in Israel and also my first time to share the panel with the ambassador. And now the ambassadors have multiplied and the stage has multiplied. And I've been able to come and go to Israel many times.
And it's a full house.
And it's a full house. So thank you all. I think it's a good question. But just like the ambassador said, the outsized impact of the midterms on the Biden administration's foreign policy thinking is not going to be seen in the short term, meaning in the next 2 years when you might want it to have an effect on the Iran file. Many people in Israel, many people in Washington have talked about a plan B, because the Biden administration's plan A, particularly since September 2020, when there was that famous op-ed by President Biden outlining his qualitatively different approach to the Iran problem in CNN in the run-up to the election, and then after he was elected, he acted on that, meaning basically he did not unilaterally revoke or pull back the sanctions that the Trump administration had put on, but he also did not aggressively enforce them. He tried to find this middle road position. And the problem in life with many middle road positions is that you actually end up ticking off both sides, and the Iranians saw this as a concession to be had. So even though now selectively we are seeing the Biden administration level on new non-nuclear sanctions on the drone file, and again on the weapons proliferation file, and in particular on the human rights file, there is not significant movement to try to change the dynamic with the JCPOA. Obviously the political costs, as the ambassador said, are quite high, and they're cognizant of it. But at the same time, I think, oddly enough, the Biden administration is quite comfortable with this, because if their plan A of restraining their own sanctions power has not gotten the Iranians to be tempted to come back to the table, and they are totally politically, philosophically opposed with Plan B, if you define Plan B as something akin to the economic maximum pressure strategy that existed from the Trump administration in 2018 and 2020, there is already a Plan C in effect here, which is the reason there is no deal is not because of Western resolve. The reason there is no deal is not because of tough American oil sanctions. The reason there is no deal is because Ali Khamenei has decided not to pick up the phone, despite the phone ringing for a year and a half. And he has felt not only quite comfortable, I think, with this position, but he's now ideologically vindicated. So while the regime is in regime survival mode at home, those are not riots, those are a continuity of protests that we saw from 2017 to present that are now fundamentally anti-regime. But abroad, the regime is trying to project strength abroad, and this is actually a measure of the regime's hubris, that it can continue to illicitly generate revenue despite some of these sanctions being on the books. And moreover, that politically it gets a benefit by constantly saying no to America. And politically, at least on the home front, no one wants to be seen, given how ultra-hardline the factional composition in Iran is today, with Raisi at the helm of the most sanctioned cabinet in Iranian history. This is not just the most sanctioned American cabinet. These guys are subject to EU, UK, US, UN, and even Interpol designations. Somewhere between 40 and 45% of that cabinet is sanctioned. That is quite the achievement for the government of the Islamic Republic to almost have 1 and 2 members of its cabinet subject to some kind of sanction. So this is just a sign. This is just a signpost of the comfortability with Iranian escalation, and conversely, the comfortability with some kind of American restraint. So while I applaud all of the growth in transatlantic coordination, I think it's been now 4 or 5 times the Canadians since September of this year have issued human rights designations. That's qualitatively a game changer. The fact that the knife that the Iranians had to the neck of the Arabs and the Israelis for 2 decades, which was the drone, missile, rocket threat, is now proliferating into Central and Eastern Europe, and now waking up Central and Eastern Europe is getting the Europeans to think more interestingly about arms designations. None of this, of course, changes the game with respect to the JCPOA, because I think if you really push any one of those diplomats or any one of those government officials, they will begrudgingly tell you that in their view, certainly not in my view, but in their view, that they still see the JCPOA as the least bad option. And if you still see that, it remains the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and no matter your intent to do something significant on the rocket, drone, missile issue, on the Iran-Russia axis, and on the Iran domestic front, so long as that is taking up all the oxygen in the room, despite the administration not talking about it as much, it is going to handcuff the most powerful tools that you have to deal with those other issues, meaning all those other sanctions, all that other talk is ornamental and not instrumental in your Iran policy.
Eldad, the Israeli view, considering the fact that we're about to change governments here, and you will answer in Hebrew, so those of you who don't understand Hebrew, hold on to your headphones.
Thank you very much.
First of all, of course, I agree with the previous speakers about the assessment that it's very difficult to re-sign the JCPOA, given the fact that there are such significantly polarized positions between Washington and Tehran. But I think that in this context, we need to emphasize a few points. First of all, the elections in Israel and also the elections in the U.S. will probably not impact the fact whether or not the JCPOA will be renewed or not. It's mainly between the U.S. and Iran. Anyhow, even if it won't be renewed, the main way, according to the American administration, will continue to be the diplomatic path. It's not that now there's some kind of a different alternative for the U.S. The U.S. will keep considering the diplomatic path the main way to attain some kind of agreements with Iran. And I think that the administration is aware of the issues. It's also stating them. I think that the administration says it very openly. We've seen Lincoln and Jack Sullivan talk about the riots in Iran. They talk about the assistance to the Ukraine, and they are also emphasizing the difficulty in the progression of the JCPOA. Now, will the U.S. and Europe, if the U.S. and Europe decide, will they decide to announce that the agreement has collapsed or that there's no way back to it? I highly doubt that. I think that we're in a scenario of kind of treading in place. On the one hand, we don't really have an agreement, but on the other hand, nobody is announcing the death of the agreement because that has implications also for the Security Council. Are they going to go for a snapback or not? And of course, additional sanctions. So the scenario of treading in place from the Israeli perspective is the most dangerous one, because on the one hand there is no agreement, and on the other hand Iran is continuing to advance and develop its nuclear program. Last night there was an Iranian announcement that it seems that they've taken yet another step. Of course, under the supervision of IAEA, they haven't published it yet, and there was a decision of the Council of Chancellors of the IAEA to address that. As for Israel and the U.S., Of course, there's an entire set of issues. It's not just the Iranian issue, but I think that the Biden administration has proven in the past 2 years that it is committed to Israel's security. And I think Biden's visit to Israel and to the region was a clear-cut proof of that. Therefore, the administration won't rush to act or adopt measures against Israel. Of course, it will first of all examine the measures of the government. Maybe if there are certain appointments, I don't want to talk about that because I really don't know, and I don't think that any official American spokespeople have addressed these nominations or appointments. But if there will be appointments, the U.S. will have to accept that because Israel is a democracy, and it'll have to accept that. The question is, what will be Israel's policy vis-a-vis the U.S., and that will have an impact. And there's one point which is important to stress. Over the past 2 years, there was a very good dialogue between the U.S. and Israel. It was intimate, it was confidential, that put on the table the problems of both countries. They didn't necessarily agree on everything, but at least it was on the table. The question is, will this dialogue continue? I hope it will. If it will continue, I think that this next government will also find an attentive ear in Washington. One of the questions we ask ourselves is how will Israel's conduct regarding the Palestinian issue, what effect will that have? Because it will probably be in contrast to the American policy or measures that have to do with human rights and minorities. How will that impact Israel's ability to have an intimate dialogue with the U.S. on Iran? I hope that they won't link between these two things, but hopefully the Israeli conduct will, if Israel's conduct will lead to a tension between the two countries, it will lead to a tension on this intimate dialogue.
Dan, you're a veteran of perhaps one of the tensest periods between the U.S. and Israel. You were the Obama administration's ambassador to Israel at a period where Netanyahu and his first government and then second government was discussing the possibility of bombing Iran. How much of the tensions remain, and do the people around President Biden carry that emotional baggage, if you'd like, from that period? Is there still suspicion over Netanyahu? How would it look like with, for instance, former Ambassador Dermer as a foreign minister in Israel? And considering the new players on the Israeli political scene, people like Smotrich or Ben-Gvir, who didn't talk much about Iran, would this be part of the discussion as well?
I don't think the personalities are really all that relevant. I'll be perfectly honest about that. Actually,
that includes Biden and Netanyahu?
No, I was about to say the one exception to that is the Biden and Netanyahu. I've spent a fair bit of time with them in a small fragment of their 40-year friendship. And the time I've spent with them, and I think there's probably others who have spent time with them together would attest to this, one can observe a real friendship, a personal friendship that has roots, and it's even extends to families and very personal matters, and B, a willingness and an ability to have a very open, very honest conversation based on an understanding that there are a lot of core principles on which they agree and core commitments on which they share, and yet have no problem having that open, honest discussion over the disagreements. And I actually think that's quite healthy. So at the level of personalities, I think those two matter. I think everything else is sort of secondary. It's a very again, I won't speculate at all about the incoming government here because that's an Israeli matter. I think the senior officials in the Biden administration have demonstrated their professionalism, demonstrated their own personal commitments to Israel's security and to a close and discreet, as Eldad says, dialogue with Israel on all the issues on the table between the governments. So I'm really not that worried about this. Look, will there be disagreements? Sure, I expect there will be disagreements, but there's no need for them to become big vocal points of political controversy. And there's actually a lot to emphasize in the area of agreement. First of all, there's an agreement on the principle that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. We sometimes suggest that that's a rhetorical device, but it's actually an important principle, especially as Iran's program has advanced, and we actually may face the decisions about how to prevent them moving past the threshold state into actually weaponization. That becomes actually a very important commitment that both sides share. Second, I think at the moment, I indicated earlier, I think the chances of talks are very low, and I think in that case, there's also quite a bit of agreement that there's really no space at the moment for a resumption of talks. And so I don't think that's going to become, at least in the short term, a point of significant disagreement. Third, clearly, Iran's support for Russia and Ukraine does change the calculus for the United States, and that I think that opens up new possible areas of cooperation. Maybe I'll say a bit more later about how Israel might capitalize on that. But fourth, there's something interesting that happened over the last year and a half of the first part of the Biden administration, which surprised me, frankly, which was to discover that among the options available, the Israeli tendency was to say we would rather live with Iran as a nuclear threshold state. They are today, essentially, I think we can all agree, nearly a nuclear threshold state, or so close to it, it barely, you can't really define it differently than that. Rather than return to an agreement that they felt would, A, have shorter breakout time built into it than the original JCPOA. That, of course, would fuel other Iranian activities with the sanctions relief revenue that would be derived, and that would only have a few years' duration before Iran might actually be able to return to that breakout status with no barrier. So that was kind of interesting to discover that an Israeli preference was to sort of land where we landed. They kind of got their way, right? They didn't want to go back into the JCPOA. We're not back in the JCPOA. Iran is all but a nuclear threshold state. And again, not that saying that anybody in Israel is happy about that, but among the available options, that was actually where they preferred to be. Fifth, I would say, again, going back to the notion that we are closer to the decision points on how do you prevent Iran from moving from this current stage of near threshold capability to weaponization and a weapon, the discussion about deterrence and the discussion about military options actually needs to be the main focus of the conversation. And again, there I think there will be areas of significant agreement. There will also be areas of disagreement about what are the triggers for military options. How do you define deterrence? Which new sanctions would you apply in this period of Iran at a threshold state? There will be disagreements about those. But again, I'll close with this. I do think that it's always better to deal with those, especially very sensitive conversations, in a quiet, discreet manner. I think, again, the Biden administration has demonstrated their ability and willingness to do this. Whoever else is in the cabinet, whoever else are the appointees, Prime Minister Netanyahu, soon-to-be Prime Minister Netanyahu, will obviously be the dominant figure in this discussion. Again, I think the personal relationship between the two leaders can actually have an important cushioning dimension on even the areas of disagreement.
Ambassador Danon, it's no secret that the major European powers were not happy about President Trump's decision to pull out of the agreement in 2018. The French position, the UK position, the Germans' perspective was quite different than President Trump's. Can you tell us more about the discussions you're having with the Americans right now? And are you all on the same page when it concerns both attitude towards Iran, possible sanctions, and what was your impression of the Israeli positions during the last year? Ambassador Shapiro mentioned this quite surprising aspect of Israel saying this, perhaps unofficially, but saying, well, it's better to have them as a threshold state than sign another agreement with them. Is it your impression as well?
Thank you very much. First thing, yes. Okay, I'm going to pick yours. Yeah. Ah oui, beaucoup mieux. The first thing, yes, we did consider that Trump's decision was a strategic mistake at that time, and that the situation would have been totally different today, and maybe better, maybe worse, but totally different. And nobody can come back to this point. And the question is what to do today, of course. But never forget that when a country like United States did not keep his word, they signed the agreement, you have a question of credibility and you have uncertainty for the allies. Because why go back to the JCPOA or something like the JCPOA today if you have at the end of it, maybe in 2 years from now, somebody who says, no, this is the worst agreement in the history. Okay, come on. What are we playing with today? And here, at that time, the position was to say this is a bad agreement, not the worst agreement in the world, but a bad agreement. And we knew the weaknesses of the JCPOA, the three weaknesses: money, and la sortie, the sunset clauses, and research and development. Okay, that's what we call in diplomacy the basket of mushrooms. You know, you have 90 good mushrooms, but 3 which are poisoned, and which can contaminate all the basket. So will you say this is a good basket or a very dangerous basket? But the role of diplomacy is to take the 3 poison mushrooms and take them into a plastic bag so that they don't contaminate the others. So that's pure diplomacy, I should say. Now, where we stand now, it's very difficult for us to talk with countries which say today, this is bad, but it's the least bad agreement. What does that mean? You know, is this a solution or it's not a solution at all to the problem? The second issue is that the sanctions squeeze Iran, maximal pressure. That did not work. Okay? Regarding the nuclear issue, of course it weakened the country, weakened the capacity of financing Hezbollah, etc. I hear that. But did it stop the nuclear? Of course, no. So the sanctions were not adapted to the nuclear problem. Is there now something that can be dealt with Iran about the nuclear issue? Personally, but it's personal, I don't think so. I think it's very difficult. And that's, for me, the difference of what is a threshold country. In France, it is generally 1 or 2 years from having capacity of having the bomb. Here in Israel, you consider a threshold country a country where you can't stop it to go to the end. It can be 2 years for this, 3 years for that, 4 years for another point of the system. But if you can't stop Iran, then it is virtually a threshold country. And that's, I think, where we stand now. Nobody has an idea of how to stop them in the nuclear field. Because, and that's something new too, they don't fear anybody. And Raisi made it clear after the US got out of Afghanistan. The discussions with the Iranians were clear. They were not in the fear of anybody. Neither the US, nor Israel, nor any coalition. So we are now with a country which is not only they don't fear the Western countries, but they are now allied with Russia and China as a an economic backdoor. This is the agreement 2 years ago. So it becomes extremely difficult to put a pressure on Iran. Okay, new sanctions. Do we really think that it's going to work on the nuclear issue? Of course not. So there will be a moment, other possibilities will have to be taken into account. That will be about the security not only of Israel, but all the countries, because you have the ballistic issue at the same time. And we'll see who will be in a position to have a new option. Of course, everybody is thinking about the military option. But once again, if there is something with Russia and China maintaining Iran under being, I should say, a threshold country, and that a country like Israel can accept that, that's a change. Okay? It's too difficult to speculate on this. Of course, I understand that being a threshold country for Israel, at least, no, you can live with that. This is the definition of a threshold country. You can live with a threshold country. But the problem is the balance of powers then, to avoid them to go to the other point, to have the bomb itself. I personally don't think that there is an interest for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, because I think that even Russia or China cannot accept that today. But we are entering now in another world. And that is the difficulty, to think about the future. If there is a kind of new division of the world order with Western countries and sunny countries, I should say, with Israel, maybe Saudi Arabia one day, but of course EU and others on one side, Russia, China, Iran and others on the other side, then maybe the nuclear order will change and the NPT will be good for the museum. But I hope this is not the case. But maybe something of that blackmail could happen in the international relations.
Behnam, I would like to I'd like you to refer, if you can, to something that Ambassador Danon has mentioned, which was the failure of the maximum pressure theory. Back in 2018, when we talked to Israelis around Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time, there was quite a lot of optimism. The general line of thinking was that either Iranian economy and, in fact, the Iranian regime would collapse under extreme pressure, or at one point or another, the Iranians would make, this is a sort of a doomsday scenario right now.
They're actually, they're cheerleading for maximum pressure.
Anyway, I'll try to focus nevertheless, and we apologize for this. I assume that there's an attempt to correct this. Anyway, the second scenario that was discussed was if the Iranians would be crazy enough to provoke the United States, then President Trump would react with all his might, and maybe problem solved for Israel. Maybe at last there will be an American military strike against Iranian nuclear sites. As we know, none of these scenarios actually materialized. Looking back at this, can you explain why this happened?
Well, we can partially explain why it happened, but there was a lot in the ambassador's comments that I think deserve a little bit further unpacking. But one of them is part of the critiques of this economic pressure strategy, which kind of sounds like a bumper sticker if you call it maximum pressure, which is a word the administration took from actually its North Korea economic sanctions playbook. But all of this is actually a philosophical question. It's not a policy question. It's not a political question. It's a philosophical question. Do you believe in the application of pressure towards this policy problem called Iran? And it's a yes or no. And then once you go to yes, it depends on how far you're willing to go. For instance, I'll give you an example. The Biden administration's Treasury Department in fall of last year did a review of its sanctions programs. It counted it among its successes in the past, meaning among the successes of U.S. sanctions in the past, the economic sanctions that were multilateral and that got America, the EU, the UN from 2006 to 2015 to the JCPOA. It did not mention, nor did it count, by its own logic, the economic sanctions from 2018 to 2020, even though the legal and political predicate for those sanctions was the same. And even though from 2018 to 2020, usually you should judge a tool by its nature. So if it's an economic sanction, you should judge it by its macroeconomic impact. In less than 2 years' time, from 2018 to 2020, unilateral U.S. economic sanctions had a greater macroeconomic impact on oil output, inflation in the country, depreciation of the real relative to the U.S. dollar, and a whole host of other macroeconomic factors we can get into. And it did it in record time, and it did it most unfortunately when the transatlantic spat was very public. But to say that maximum pressure failed would be not to denigrate the administration, it would be to denigrate that policy tool, and it would put you back to square one, because this would bring you back to the philosophical question, how did we get the JCPOA? Remember, the Obama administration used to fight Congress tooth and nail from 2009 to 2013 against all the sanctions that from 2013 to 2016 it took political credit for. It used to water down those oil sanctions from 2009 to 2012-13. And then ultimately, once the JCPOA was achieved with that economic leverage, it was traded away, and then it looked like the administration owned the sanctions portfolio the whole time. So what I'm saying here is that there are some people who believe that the sanctions was the primary ingredient in the cocktail that got the Iranians to the table, and that ultimately, because this regime has only selectively in its history altered its foreign and security policy, it's actually a fairly consistent foreign and security policy. The nuclear program was resurrected during the Iran-Iraq War. It was particularly resurrected in '83, and then the civilian veneer that they put on in the 2000s when they were negotiating with the E3 came later. But ultimately, this was always a military program. It's not the possible military dimensions. It always had a quest for this strategic deterrent for the regime. To export the revolution, to keep the homeland safe, for status, for security. This is identical with the regime's foreign policy quest. So if it's going to be traded away or handicapped, it has to come when there is significant exogenous pressure. And one of the things that actually was said during this maximum pressure period, it was said by actually Rouhani once and Iran's then Minister of Oil 2 or 3 times, which is that the impact of these U.S. unilateral sanctions were greater than the 8-year macroeconomic impact of the Iran-Iraq War. That should have been a wake-up call. I actually wrote an article about this. I'm sure no one read it. But the Iran-Iraq War in Iran is called the Holy Defense or the Sacred Defense. Every IRGC general, most parliamentarians, anybody who's politically anybody, cut their teeth on this issue through service in this time. So to say that these U.S. unilateral sanctions were akin to that game-changing formative experience for the revolution, it would be a mistake to miss that. And I think, unfortunately, we did miss that not because of the substance. We missed that because of the style and the way the administration left, the style of the transatlantic alliance management. So much so that I remember, now that there is Iranian drones going to Russia, I remember in August, September 2020, the Trump administration tried to unilaterally extend the arms embargo. And most unfortunately, America's friends, not just in the Security Council, but throughout the UN system, laughed at this unilateral attempt. I don't think anybody is laughing now that there's more Iranian weapons that could have been subject to that arms embargo coming into Central and Eastern Europe. So it shows you that the Iran problem is not a yes or is not going to be qualified this way. And to what the ambassador said, I think ultimately a lot of countries are content not with solving the problem, but with trying to manage the problem. And in this management quest, do you want your adversary to have more cash on hand or less on hand? Because the nuclear part of the equation is actually quite clear. If the Iranians see that there is significant resolve, they will incrementally escalate. So when the administration left the deal 2018, it took 1 year for the Iranians to first begin their policy of incremental escalation. In the first year, they actually did not begin the overt violations of the deal. What they hoped was that the U.S. unilateral sanctions would fail. Starting in 2019, they began the policy of every 90 days selectively violating publicly one of the elements of the deal to hope to create like a drip effect to scare the U.S. Back into the deal. Ultimately, one of the things that I thought would happen and was a little bit disappointed in the transatlantic community in was that once the Iranians even got to 20%, and then later on to 60% after the Trump administration, when the Biden administration came in. And once there was things like the production of uranium metal, and once there was more and more advanced centrifuges being built, tested, stored, and deployed in Iran, that one saving grace of the JCPOA was never enacted. That snapback mechanism was never enacted. So to pivot to the other ambassador's comments here, why is Iran actually still flirting with this idea if it's so comfortable and if it's able to survive these sanctions? It's doing it because it's going to run the clock on snapback, and that dangling the idea of talks, even when we know the administration is not going to be able politically perhaps to go back into the deal, achieves another thing, which is it creates a political handicap to potentially that military strike that may have to be on the table if these sanctions continue to be denigrated and then ultimately, if they're enforced, belatedly enforced. So it's designed to create more of a political handicap. But ultimately, I think you judge a tool by its macroeconomic output. If you're the one who believes that it was the U.S. concessions in the Oman Channel and the nature of the JPOA in 2013, which permitted enrichment, even though 5 UN Security Council resolutions said not to enrich, then you are going to be skeptical of sanctions anyway. And in your view, the only way to get a deal with Iran is going to be a concession, to placate them. And sometimes in international relations, you have to kick the can down the road. But ladies and gentlemen, as Israel knows perhaps better than anyone, we're in a position now where we're not down the road, we're in a small hallway, and we're not kicking the can into an empty space, we're kicking it against the wall, and in 2 to 4 years' time, it's going to bounce back and hit all of us. And I think that's one of the issues with this JCPOA debate that is not well fleshed out.
Eldad, let's go back to Israel for a minute and talk about Israeli options. There's a general, almost a consensus here that there's not much of a chance that talks would be resumed anytime soon. Assuming that there will be a new government led by Netanyahu, who has dealt with this issue perhaps most of his adult life, where is Israel going? What are the options on the table? What should be addressed? And what would be the priorities for Israel? Again, assuming that there's no deal anytime soon.
Easy question. To solve the problem.
I think that, first of all, we need to say that there was no great difference between Netanyahu's government's policy, the former one, and that of Bennett/Lapid's in the Iranian context. Both governments saw in the JCPOA a huge problem and tried to prevent as much as possible the renewal of negotiations over it. And it seems to have worked. With or without Israel's intervention, the JCPOA is currently less relevant. However, I think that along the way, Israel did not present an alternative, a significant alternative to the JCPOA, except to impose pressure on Iran. And pressure on Iran is all well and good, but will it help us achieve our goal? That's one point I wanted to make. Another point I wanted to make was that in recent days we've been hearing a lot of criticism on the United States and the West. We heard what was attributed to Derma, who will be Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yesterday Khulata, who is Israel's national security advisor, also said in Manama that he also passed criticism against the United States, saying that they don't do enough and they ignore us, etc. Now, criticism is one thing. The question is, what does it mean? When we constantly criticize the West, I think it expresses, to a large extent, our problem. Because if we had the option, if Israel had the option without the West, then perhaps we wouldn't have had to criticize it. But we do. Because, I guess, we believe, or hope, or want, or dream that the West will solve the problem for us. And I think that what we've heard here from Ambassador Danon and from Ambassador Shapiro is that the West does not have the tools to solve this problem because there's a huge gap between the way that the West views this problem and the way Israel views this problem. For Israel, it is an existential, immediate threat that must be solved here and now, whereas the West does not feel the same way. Not only does Iran not pose as much of a threat to the West as it does to Israel, but the West has many other issues to grapple with. And we all know the challenge posed by China to the United States and the war in Ukraine, which is also forcing the West to invest. And I think that Ambassador Danon clearly spoke of the Israeli problem. That is the gap between the level of the threat, how they view the threat, and how Israel views the level of threat. And I think the right thing would be, if we're talking about a discourse or a dialogue between Israel and the Biden administration, and the Biden administration understands everything very well. I don't think it's any news to them what Israel wants. However, what are the options? That's the question. And the options are limited. I think an Israeli demand that the pressure exerted on Iran will be increased is a problem. And also, building an offensive, effective option is also a problem, because the United States has already clarified that they do not want to go into another war, especially not with Iran at present. And enrichment in Iran is not perceived as the same level of threat in the West as it does in Israel, in terms of Iran's progress towards a bomb. So we're left with very limited options. And by the way, even if the JCPOA were signed, Israel would have very limited options, because we are we're very near the outbreak point. Now, I think Israel should take a few approaches of action. First of all, Israel should have its own option. I'm not going into operative avenues, but Israel should have one. First of all, by way of deterring Iran, but also by way of pushing the West. And Israel should mostly try, together with the West, to formulate those red lines that shouldn't be crossed, those steps that can be taken, like the snapback, for instance, all those things that can make it harder for Iran to continue the way it is progressing, especially at a time like this, when there are riots. But mostly it should prepare for a situation in which we will be seeing Iran taking steps with its enrichment and preparing for this situation. Because aside from a military option, an independent one, which I don't think really exists, because in any case, even if Israel were to attack Iran, it would need American backup, it would need a political umbrella. And even in the past, when such an option was on the table, Israel thought that it should require this political umbrella to accompany it. So I don't think that in the current global situation, when there are so many challenges, this situation is really happening.
I'd like all panelists, if I may, to address the most interesting issue, in my view, in recent weeks or months, which is, of course, the protests in Iran. A huge wave. It may not be the end of the regime, as many of us may hope, but still quite a significant development in recent years. And some have compared it to the so-called Green Revolution of 2009, later on the riots in 2019. Somehow this seems perhaps more serious would be the right term, or something that is here to stay. Is this really a challenge for the Iranian regime? And how much could the world intervene? I know that there are going to be other discussions about this issue later on, but I think we have to mention this, because it may be the elephant in the room right now. Is this about to change our perspective of the Iranian regime's position in international relationship? Is it that serious? And perhaps as we speak today, the Iranian football or soccer team is facing its first game during the World Cup, and it will be interesting to see how many of those players will actually do something to show solidarity towards their own people who are marching and demonstrating in the streets of Tehran and risking their lives trying to change something from within.
Well, I'll go first, but I obviously hasten to emphasize I'm not an expert on the internal dynamics of Iranian policy or Iranian society. I will say that one can only take immense inspiration from the courage and the bravery of first the women and girls, and now it seems to have spread to many other parts of the Iranian population to put themselves at risk and do so publicly and state and demonstrate and go to the streets in the most really quite moving ways to say this is an unacceptable, brutal regime that stifles our lives, that bankrupts our country, that corrupts our economy, that torments our neighbors. And we've had enough. And it seems to be very heavily focused on a younger generation that maybe was not even a party to some of those earlier waves of protests, but this is what they grew up with. They grew up in this system, and they think this system is corrupt and must be ended. So to that extent, it requires of all of us, first of all, to demonstrate our support for them. There are things the U.S. administration is doing. I'm sure there's more that can be done to facilitate communication through various internet and other channels so that the protesters can coordinate and do what they need to do. Obviously, Iran should be condemned in every possible forum, certainly in places where it's absurd that they even have a seat, such as the UN Council on the Status of Women. And there's, I think, a wide consensus that that's completely unacceptable. And so this should be a very heavy focus of U.S. policy, I think, of global policy. Hope very much, obviously, the U.S. will defeat Iran in the World Cup, not for this reason, but as another opportunity. But look, it also is probably the case that in the context of these ongoing protests, which may or may not threaten the regime. It's very hard to know. One might say if the regime really felt they were threatened, they would have already crushed them even more brutally than they have. One might say we haven't seen defections in the security services that are the signs that this is actually crumbling. And again, there's a lot we don't know, or certainly I don't know. But while they are underway, I believe it's close to impossible to imagine, and I mean this in political terms, a resumption of a deal that would require a massive infusion of sanctions or relief revenue into the Iranian economy and into the Iranian regime's hands. So I think in some ways, whether they intend it or not, whether they're even thinking about it or not, these brave protesters have actually shaped the options available for the international community on a completely different issue. Where that leaves us, with Iran already at some near threshold capacity, is a different question. But in some ways, I think that has shaped and narrowed the options available. If I could just, before I give up the microphone, this may be my last chance to say just two words about the other major event that has changed the dynamics, and that's Ukraine. And that's particularly Iran's assistance to Russia in its brutal war in Ukraine. There's no secret, I think everybody can see, the immense priority that the Biden administration and the West as a whole have placed on ensuring Russia is defeated in this war. $40 billion at least of U.S. assistance already to the Ukrainian military, a very significant effort to shore up the NATO alliance and even to add new members to the alliance and to ensure all of those countries are contributing in different ways to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. This is obviously going to be priority number one. Eldad says that Iran is not the same priority, at least in immediacy and at least in how acute it's seen by Western states as it is by Israel. That's obvious. But this one is. And so I think it creates an opportunity for Israel. To, especially as Iran has really joined the Russian camp in a very violent way with the provision of drones, and perhaps ballistic missiles are next, to not just criticize Iran, which it deserves, not just drive additional Western sanctions toward Iran because of those weapons provisions, which it deserves, but also to put itself more firmly, let's put it that way, in the Western camp in support of Ukraine. There are forms of assistance beyond humanitarian assistance that Ukraine seeks from Israel. There are weapon systems that Israel has not yet decided that it could provide to Ukraine for missile defense and for other forms of defense that don't even require the kinds of weapons systems that would put at risk Russian lives. There are sanctions against Russia that Israel has not yet joined. So there are opportunities here for Israel to help consolidate in the context of Ukraine, that is the #1 priority for the United States and the West, that same alliance in a way that I think would benefit its own goals with respect to Iran.
Perhaps a short follow-up. How do you explain the fact that Israel hesitated for so long, and how much is the Biden administration bothered by this Israeli position?
Look, I think we all understand the dilemmas Israel faces, and they're real dilemmas. I don't think anybody should pretend they're not. Russia's presence in Syria and the necessity to deconflict air operations in Syria so that Israel can strike at Iranian targets there is obviously very important. The status of the Jewish community in Russia is obviously an important concern that any Israeli government must take into account. So there are legitimate dilemmas. I accept them. And yet, at some point in a crisis, and maybe when your arch enemy joins one side of that crisis, is the moment that maybe the choice becomes a little clearer, and it's possible to choose a little more overtly between those two dilemmas. Look, I think the Biden administration has again expressed some understanding for those dilemmas and the limits it places on Israeli policy, and as it does with every ally in the world, it urges Israel to do more to support Ukraine than it has done so far.
Plus, sometimes you should be on the right side of history, but that's another matter. Ambassador Danon, could you address the protests in Iran and the French position over what's been happening there? And is there a line that Europe and the West should not cross while identifying, showing solidarity to those brave protesters and so on? Could this be counterproductive at one point because the regime might use it as to claim that those demonstrating are actually not Iranian patriots?
I'm not a specialist of domestic Iranian policy, but what we see is, of course, extremely important and new, because for the moment it has been something about the hijab or the chador as the beginning of something. It's always the case. Look at the Arab Springs. It begins with something symbolic but not so important, but very important for the life of people. And then, if there is not immediately the adequate response of the government, it slowly comes to other issues. So time is against the regime. And for the moment, they are not open to change. Maybe after, I don't know, 2 weeks, if they are said, okay, hijab for the girls is no more an issue, they can do what they want, probably the revolution would have stopped. But this is not the case. And that's the moment where you see that a regime cannot change and put in place the right reforms. So probably it will continue and degenerate. But nobody knows if it will go to the end of this regime. Absolutely nobody can know this in advance. Now, about the support of Europe. We said very clearly our support to these girls, women, and now the population, with no limit. There are new sanctions about 3 organizations, including Iranian TV, which is now under sanction, and 26 dignitaries of the regime. Will this be enough? Absolutely not. But that is the list that we can put in place, of course. If we don't do that, we do nothing. So that's the beginning of something. Can we help them more? Yes, for instance, as a symbol, the President Macron got at the Élysée Palace a meeting with 30 Iranian NGOs and people, etc. So this is important, this is a support, but this is symbolic. If you now ask for real actions on the ground, I don't think that we have many margins of maneuver about that. About the US sanctions, I never said that they had no impact. I said no impact on the nuclear issue, but probably because it has impacted the population, it is part of the revolution of today, of these Iranian girls and men who want to change the regime because they suffered from the policy of the regime which led to economic sanctions from the whole world. And now, about Israel, yeah, the difficulty has been perfectly put on the table. Everybody can understand that Israel cannot be too strong against Russia because there is a need for the security of Israel to intervene in Syria. And if you have the S-300 and the S-400, it's not so easy to intervene. So there is a question of security, no doubt about that. So nobody criticized Israel about this. And there is another issue, which is the pressure of the Russian government about the Jewish agency and the Jews in Russia. So I do understand why Israel is so cautious about that, because the Russian government could do things against the Jews in Russia, which would be a disaster. So we understand. And it is interesting to see that about 25,000 Ukrainians arrived in Israel, but 32,000 Russians arrived in Israel. The first because of the war, the second because of the repression on culture and the press, etc., etc. So it is rather complicated for Israel. And if I were at the place of the government, there's no need for me to do more than express a total solidarity with Ukraine, be clearly in the Ukrainian camp, say, with allies, etc., but do more than what they do today would be extremely dangerous. And in the balance of Israel interests, I do understand. And when I say I, for the first time, as a name of my government, France understands perfectly what is going on here. You heard no criticism about Israeli position vis-à-vis. And you know, it was so difficult. You remember at the very beginning, Naftali Bennett, he went to Moscow and tried to do something in terms of mediation, but it was not possible because you can't be at the same time in a position of not telling what you want to tell to the Russians because of Syria. So he tried, and then I think that domestic policy, it's extraordinary how there was a consensus for Russians and Ukrainians here in Israel not to be in tension. And I think that it is very interesting how it has been managed. In many countries, you have difficulties between Russians and Ukrainians. Here in Israel, everybody, I think, thought that nothing had to happen again between these two communities, and I think it's quite a success for Israel about
Apologies. So not to do a crash course on Iranian protest history, but there is some context that matters very much here to know what has changed and what is different from different iterations of Iranian protests in the past. Number one, as long as there has been an Islamic Republic for 43 years, there have been domestic protests against the Islamic Republic. So there has been 43 years of Islamic Republic, there's been 43 years of protest against the Islamic Republic. Particularly since the Islamic Republic has mandatorily imposed the gender discriminatory veiling and the modesty dress since 1979-1980, there have been Iranian women who have been bravely risking life and limb to protest this discriminatory veiling and dress codes in public. This stuff obviously escalated in 2010 with the creation, or in the mid-2000s with the creation of the morality police, which violently enforced these discriminatory dress codes. But this record is important because to see the protest today as merely an anti-hijab protest is to miss the forest through the trees. This is connected to the larger political process in Iran and the streets and the society's engagement or lack of engagement with the state. In 1999 and in 2009, those were two periods of protest that began in Tehran with the urban elite. 2009, the Green Movement, the stealing of an election from a reformist candidate. 1999, the storming of Tehran University after the closure of a major reformist newspaper, where young urban elites, primarily but not only limited to the capital, began to protest and then somewhat broader around the nation in favor of a particular faction of the Islamic Republic, in favor of something tied to the reform movement. Critically, what happened in that decade between 99 and 2009, and more importantly, 2009 to 2017, was the domestic failure of the reform movement, the moving away from the population, away from reform, and towards revolution against the system in its entirety, the overpromise and the underdelivery of the economic, social, and political benefits of the JCPOA, and about a decade of missed critical labor strikes that laid the political foundation for that when protests began in late 2017 and have continued in a different iteration to present. These protests are qualitatively different. They're fundamentally anti-regime protests. They're almost blue-collar nationalist protests. And even though they are all political protests, and in the West we make this mistake all the time, these are all political protests that have a distinctly non-political trigger. What does that mean? December 2017, it started with the price of eggs. To see this, as unfortunately some Western reporters saw, as a food price protest would be to miss the forest through the trees, would be to miss the social and political milieu, if you will, that created these conditions. And this series of protests from 2017, 18, 19, 20, partially under COVID, 20 to 21, and then in 2022, this is not the first Iranian protest. There were significant protests back in May. And this is also not the first Iranian female protests. There were significant anti-hijab protests in 2018, the White on Wednesdays, the Daughters of Engelab Square. They've done all of this before. So this is part of this larger anti-regime movement that we see on the street against the state, because the chasm between state and society is huge and fundamentally at this point irreparable. You have a revolutionary regime that is Islamist and authoritarian, and a post-revolutionary society that is nationalist and seeking something secular. And this cocktail cannot be mixed together and become equal. They are fundamentally different things. And one of the most powerful criticisms that you see is that the people are saying that the Islamic Republic is a poor guardian of the Iranian national interests. You know, there's a term that the ambassador used. I don't like to use it. This is not a criticism of you in the slightest. Big fan. But the word is Iranian regime. There is nothing Iranian about this regime. The Islamic Republic has all the hallmarks of a third world authoritarian, resource-dependent dictatorship. It is an insult to the legacy, many of you have Persian friends, it is an insult to the legacy of everything that you could call Iranian. This is why you've seen from those 2017 to present protests, not just the Not Gaza, not Lebanon, My Life for Iran slogan, but also the slogan of, in front of government buildings, our enemy is here, they lie when they say it's America, or other slogans that basically say principlist, reformist, the game is over. This is fundamentally an anti-regime protest, and it's going to continue. And it actually can continue with significant foreign pressure against the regime, And it needs to continue to be marrying the street power with strike power to pose a significant threat. That's precisely how the Islamic Revolution came about, when sustained street pressure was married with sustained economic pressure across key sectors of society: energy, civil society, the service sector, and higher education. You have those strikes be sustained and they're married with street power. The fact that these protests are in their third month would be amplifying the threat that exists to the regime. So there's so much more that the West can do. Step number one, of course, I know we're running out of time, is do no harm. Don't just put the deal on the back burner. Close the door on the deal in its entirety, because whether you want the deal now or 3 years from now or 4 years from now or 6 months from now, if you do this deal, you are enriching the apparatus of repression inside the Islamic Republic. And as hopefully would be clear for everybody here, you are also enriching the apparatus of aggression that was felt in the region and is now being felt in Central and Eastern Europe.
But
In my positions in the Intelligence Directorate, I closely monitored the riots in 2009 during Ahmadinejad's term in office, which were perceived by the Iranian regime, despite what you said about it not being a regime, but still the Iranian leadership, it was perceived as an existential threat or a significant threat. And we saw that the Iranian regime has learned two things. First of all, we need to stop the protesters from having leadership, and that way they will not be able to create an alternative to the regime. Second of all, the regime prepared a whole series of ways by which to grapple with these protests, and I think only some of them are being used. And we're talking about whether we are in a revolutionary stage in Iran or in a revolution. And I think that even if there is a kind of definition of a revolutionary stage, still we are very far from revolution. And what does a revolution mean? A revolution means that in Iran a regime will be created that will be open and friendly to the West and all sorts of things like that, that will not promote the nuclear program. And I don't think we should be counting on that. I don't think we're in that place where we will soon be in that position. And one last point about Ukraine. It's important for me to say one thing. I, as an Israeli citizen, can criticize the Israeli government because I think that ahead of time Israel should have had a different approach to Ukraine, to be on the right side of history. And the United States is Israel's key and strategic ally. We have special relations with the United States. We cannot be anywhere else. We have to be there because it's much more important to preserve our special relations with the United States than any kind of relations with Russia, where here too I don't think it's that significant.
Toda Rabba. One final word before I turn the microphone back to Sima. Discussing the possibilities of regime change and so on, I was reminded of the fact that I think in 2003, I interviewed Bogi Elon, who was then Chief of Staff of the IDF and will be a panelist, I think, in the afternoon for our Haaretz. And the headline was, the time is right, or the conditions are ripe for a regime change in Iran. That was 2003. One can yet hope. Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a very interesting discussion, and also thank our audience for showing up. It's nice to see a full house at the INSS again, and for bearing with us considering the lights problem and so on.